Hello, welcome to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick. With me is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Hey, good day to you, sir.
All right, so let's dive right in. We are continuing on with our discussion of Genesis 2 verses 1 through 3, and we're looking at the wrap up, the end of the creation, narrative here that we saw throughout Genesis 1. And we're going to focus specifically on this idea of rest. It's it's odd. It's an odd term. It's a weird thing to think of, I think, somewhat, when we think of the idea of God. So I think the reason we would want to develop some sort of understanding of what is meant here is because we do see later the commandment to honor the Sabbath. And that is very much tied to this idea of rest. And so we being the image of God within creation, sort of collectively, we're meant to be the image of God within creation. It makes sense to then ask, what does it mean then to rest as the image of God? And so the first thing I've noticed when digging into this and looking closer at the word here and reading a lot of commentary on the term, rest is probably not the greatest translation for what's being described in this verse, and that's largely because of the implications that the term carries today, that it did not have so much in the past, but definitely that we carry today. So before we dive further into that, there's a perspective on the whole creation story here that I think is worth consideration, that I don't buy into entirely, as we've done our own little narrative here, but I think there is a lot to take away from this particular perspective. And that is the perspective of a man named John H. Walton, and he shares it in his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1. And he argues that the whole of this creation narrative would have been recognized by ancient man as being a temple establishment narrative. And so this is because it bears a lot of striking similarities to what you would see in some of the mythology of the surrounding cultures, in terms of this idea of gods establishing temples. And it follows much of that pattern, which he breaks down there in the book. And it's a worthwhile read, definitely worth taking a look at. But basically, the way that narrative works is the first 6 days describes God preparing the earth as his temple. And the 7th day is the act of taking up residence in that temple, taking up and reigning within that temple.
This is, can I jump in just for a sec? Just because I'm looking at other instances of the term rested, and the other instances are the cloud of the Lord resting in the tabernacle.
Yes.
When it says he resided there, or the cloud rested over the tabernacle. Numbers 9:18 is a reference. He rested over the tabernacle. They remained in the camp. So that's interesting. That's interesting that the same word is being used. And so, I mean, it could be a way in which these two stories are rhyming.
There's a lot
the culture
there. That
the
Garden of Eden is often compared to the tabernacle, and whatnot. And there would be an argument made by some, I think Walton sort of gets into this a little bit in his book too, the idea that the garden is like this outer courtyard of the temple, where God in his temple can meet man in the garden, and that's where they sort of come together to meet perfectly, which obviously symbolically makes a lot of sense. So I think the relating to the tabernacle there makes a lot of sense, with this term. But in the ancient world, if you are taking somewhat of this temple establishing narrative from this, rest here would not be so much the absence of doing something, which is what we tend to think of rest as, is, oh, I need to rest, I need to stop doing things, I need to rest. And it would be more the routine work of reigning, right? So it would be as though a king were no longer going out and conquering new lands or establishing new borders or all of those kind of things, and simply reigning over his kingdom, right? More of the routine process of being king rather than, growing the kingdom. And so I think that gets us closer to the way I would think about this verse, and the way I think we should think about this idea of rest. Um, I think it's the end of the verse that is particularly tricky for some, and there's a case that I saw some scholars suggesting that I thought was pretty interesting, that the end of the verse could really be summed up to say something closer to the idea that God ceased creating so that he could make. So it's not that God ceased his creation so that he could rest. He ceased his creation, bara, that bara term, and it wasn't just to stop doing things. It was to make. And if you think about the difference, there is a difference between creating something and then working with that thing that's been created, right?
Yeah.
A way to think of it might be a sculptor, right? They might make the clay first, or create the clay that they're going to form, right? They would get the water and shape it and get it moist and get it where it needs to be, and then they would do the process of actually making it and shaping it into a vase and forming it into something. So there's that sort of two-part act of creation. And so it sort of implies, if you think of it this way, that God has established these rules, right? As we talked about, I think the previous episode, he's established these rules in days 1 through 6 for, how creation is going to work. These are, fundamental, inherent within this universe laws of the way everything operates. And now within that, he's going to make something. He's not going to change those rules, but he's going to form something out of it. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's something to that component, and the arguments for that translation are interesting, I think, and make a good point.
I have a couple of contentions against that I think there is a ceasing of working related to the idea of rest. My argument would be that is looking at the way in which God provided in Exodus for the people with manna, and the way in which manna was provided in a manner that allowed them to not go out and work and get in the act of gathering food on the Sabbath. So there is clearly a ceasing of working involved in that. Well, I would also go to look at the ways in which it's described later on. If you go to Exodus, you can see it says, it is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed.
Yes.
And so there's something there's something restorative in the act, and I don't think it necessarily.
I don't disagree. I think there's an important thing, and I think we'll get to it more maybe next episode. But consider very much the example of Jesus being here on the Sabbath, right? And his disciples picking the grain and eating it, and he had no problem with that. Or he talked about the importance of when he healed on the Sabbath, and he pointed out and said, if your cow fell in a well, on the Sabbath, you're not going to just leave it there. You're going to go ahead and get the cow out. Not a problem.
Correct.
And it's okay to do that. And that is the idea, I think, of sort of a maintenance concept, right? And to make,
I don't think that's maintenance.
Maintenance.
I mean, if your cow falls in the well, that's responding to an unexpected event. Maintenance normally is planned.
No, I think
maintenance is expected work.
We just moved into a place. It's a new building, right? There was a leak by one of the tubs here, and so the ceiling, they just replaced it and all of that and fixed the pipes. That's maintenance. That's a maintenance cost.
Correct. But normally it's scheduled unless it's an emergency.
But it's also not, right?
Unless it's an emergency, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that's the point of Christ's. All three of those, I think, have, and I think there's a reason there's three different examples, because I think all three of them have a purpose behind them. I mean, the cow falling in the well is saying, look, if something unexpected happens, you're not forced to be comatose during the Sabbath. And if you have the opportunity to do good on the Sabbath, do good. Or if you have to do something in order to provide for yourself, doing good is the healing. And then if you have to do something in order to provide for yourself on the Sabbath, as in eat something, then feel free to pick something up and eat it. So, but I think it's far more pragmatic than saying this is the guide for how your Sabbaths are supposed to be conducted.
No. I think you're misunderstanding what I say when I say maintenance, right? Because maintenance is, it can be scheduled, but it also comes up unexpectedly, right? And maintenance is the act of. So think about our premise here, and we'll have to look into it this way. We've been talking about this ordering of creation, right? But we started from a point of chaos, right? And we go from chaos to God establishing order, and God wants us to continue that process of establishing order. But if we don't continue to establish order, things will revert back to chaos, right? To me, the maintenance is simply preventing the regression. You're not moving forward, but you're preventing the regression back into chaos. Because if you do absolutely nothing, chaos will creep in and take over again, right? It will revert back to the chaos.
I think that's the exact reason,
the order that is there.
I think that's the exact reason why the commandment to rest on the Sabbath is given. It is given to say that, look, you should take a day where you're not combating the chaos. That the chaos won't come, that even God is faithful enough to say that if I quit the act of creating, that I will be, that things will remain established for a day.
And I think what's being said is there should be a day where you're not attempting to advance, but you can't regress on that day. So you might be continuing to move forward, right? On the other 6 days. On the other 6 days, keep moving forward. On that 7th day, simply just don't move backwards. So if you need to eat in order to keep from moving backwards into the chaos, as the disciples did, eat. If you need to rescue the cattle that has fallen in the well, because that is a falling backwards into the chaos, right? That is a disordered thing. Then go ahead and rescue the cow. Mm-hmm. Now, you're not on that day going out and acquiring more cows or trying to break new land for the cows to eat or anything like that, right? You're not furthering the ordering process, but you are preventing the regression if need be.
I think "if need be" is the most important phrase there, because Absolutely. I think those are illustrated Absolutely. As but if exceptions.
You're God, if you're God and you're literally in charge of all of it, then there's always a needs be, right? I mean, God.
No, now you've gone a loop around it, and you've kind of completely avoided the command to rest by saying, look, if you're God, there's always going to be a reason, because I think that's the point. Where,
like I said,
is saying even God rests.
Yeah, but rest is not the right
even
word.
God.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying rest is the incorrect word. The word that they argue again for that one is that word would be better translated as ceased.
Fair enough.
So
presides seems reasonable if we're talking about a God presiding over a temple.
At the end of the next episode, we'll get to what I really think the word should be. But what I'm trying to say right now is that rest is not the correct term. So if you keep falling back on rest and that term, then yeah,
Well,
of
there's
course, what I'm
very
saying is not going to
clearly
make sense.
a ceasing of activity.
No,
There's very
there's a
clearly a
ceasing of
ceasing of
one kind
activity.
of activity. There's not a ceasing of activity altogether. There's a very clearly a ceasing of one kind of activity.
Then what? Then the commandment to rest on the Sabbath day and be refreshed seems like we're stretching things in order to fit the way we want to view this.
No, so we'll get to that more next episode, because I don't want to stretch it out too long here for people. But there is another term that captures that sentiment exactly, that we're gonna get to. But that discussion would probably stretch it out a bit too much right here. But yes, the idea is the Sabbath should contain the idea of resting and being refreshed. But there's nothing, let me put it this way. There's nothing refreshing about sliding back into chaos.
Well, there's nothing refreshing about fixing a pipe in an emergency or trying to get your cow out of the well. If
Right,
your
but
cow happens to fall on the well.
It is significantly more refreshing than if you were to simply let that go.
Simply let the cow go?
Yeah, let the cow go.
Correct.
The
the thing I'm taking exception with is that I thought we established agreement of those are exception cases. And so what the advice that's being given is that respond to the issues when they arise. If there is an emergency that arises, okay, fair enough. And then, but your cow doesn't fall in the well every Sabbath. In fact, ideally, if you're thinking ahead and responsibly setting up your temple, we'll say, you're making sure that your cow falls in a well maybe once every 3 years. And so then by all means respond to it and do what you need to do. But those are exception cases. The comment that you made though was, but if you're God, there's constantly exception cases. So what you're implying is that you will always have to be working on the Sabbath day.
I'm saying if you are God, the whole, without God maintaining the things he set into place in chapters 1 through days 1 through 6, right? Unless he maintains the sun and the moon in their orbit and the stars, and unless the water remains separated from the land, unless those things are maintained, which he is the being which maintains those, everything will slide back into chaos. So even in his rest, he must maintain these things.
I disagree with that.
How so?
How do I disagree with that? I think that would imply that he has not pulled away from creation, that he has not set the thing in motion for man to work with.
I'm saying the words described in the verse here are translated poorly, and they don't imply this sort of separation from creation.
Yeah, but presiding in a kingdom doesn't, let's say you establish a temple and build it, it doesn't mean that you're holding up the walls the entire time. The walls have been built, and it's very rare that you have to repair them.
Right. The walls have been built and are maintained because of the rules that God sets into place.
Correct. And they don't need to be held up every day.
Right. But I'm saying if you're the source of those rules, then you are still engaged with those. If God is the source of everything, then everything persists in its existence through his desire for it to do so. So he clearly hasn't ceased his desire for this to exist. And in a way, he is then still engaged with us and engaged with creation if he is allowing it to exist. It's not like, I guess what I'm saying is I don't even think that it doesn't even make sense for there to be the possibility of God to like create something and then say, all right, I'm going over here. You guys are on your own now, right? Like he can't, then it would cease to exist. Like the very fabric of reality exists because of God. God holds all of reality together.
That's a very different, again, I think if we're reading this along the analogy, number one, in regards to capability, I think it is possible for God to create something separate from himself and allow it to continue. But the thing that's being analyzed in this text is looking at it as, what does it mean for God to rest? And again, I think it's a different activity. What it seems like you're arguing is if this is a temple building analogy, God creates the temple and then stands and holds up the walls the entire time. And it's like, well, no, that's not what presiding in a temple is. Presiding is all that work has been done, and now I sit in the temple, and I exist there in the temple.
Agreed. And
that's not a work activity.
Okay, but that's why it's a metaphor. It's not an exact, like, this.
Correct, but we have no reason to suggest
what God's doing.
But correct, but based on that, we have no reason to suggest that for some reason God's working at that time too. Presiding in a temple, existing in the temple is not. That's not constructing something new.
We would have to. Okay. Yeah, no, I think we actually would have to presume that there is. I mean, the idea being, and this is not exclusive to me, this idea, this is commonly held by many, is that the very fabric of the universe is held together because of God. And without God, without his interjection, the very fabric of the universe would fall apart. That's not, again, that's I think you can go back to Augustine actually with that idea. That is a long held idea. And so I am suggesting that act then of making sure the universe continues to hold together, and that those laws of physics that you're speaking of, that for us we might rely on to hold the temple up, that is a kind of continued engagement that God has. And that continued engagement,
I have no idea. In that instance, like I don't mind disagreeing with St. Augustine.
Yeah, no,
I don't think there's clear evidence for that. I don't think the text gives clear evidence that is what is occurring, and I would tend to read it the opposite, even if we're retranslating the word rested.
You do have to strike you'd have to strike one or the other. You'd have to strike the temple establishing narrative, or you would have to strike the ongoing seventh day, because clearly God does still engage with his creation.
But that could be maintenance. That could be the emergency maintenance that I'm referencing. I'm saying that's where the exception goes on, because that's the thing that I took issue with, was when you said that if you're God, there are constantly exceptions where you're having to work. And my argument is, no, there's not. This gets actually at it, is God is resting for millennia. That's why you don't see miracles every day. Is miracles don't need to take place because the water pipes don't go out. Your cow doesn't fall in a well every day. It is very, very rare that happens.
Yes,
and that's why miracles are very, very rare.
And I don't suggest miracles are the only act of maintenance.
Fair enough. Still rare. That's what I'm trying to get at, is that God is not actively adjusting things within reality.
No, not adjusting. Well, adjusting maybe works fair too.
I have zero problem with both narratives.
I wouldn't consider miracles as the only act of maintenance. I think God's interaction with us, right? His revelation of himself to us, and revelation of his will to us.
No, I consider that relationship building, and I don't consider that work in the same sense as I consider fixing a pipe. Like if I go out on a date with my wife, I don't consider that the same thing as going to work a job or having to fix the disposal or something like that. Those are very different activities, and I would consider those to be very different activities for God as well.
They're different activities based on the circumstances, but certainly going out on a date with your wife is maintenance in a sense for that relationship you have with your wife.
Correct, but I
Or
would
it
put
could
those
be
in
the
two
act of
different
furthering.
activities. I think she would take it as an insult if I suggested it was some type of work.
And that's what I'm saying. It's a different kind of work. Maintenance is a different kind of work. Maintenance, though, is about the prevention. This is what I'm saying. Work, right? The subduing of the earth. That is the going forth and advancing and bringing something into order. That is going from evening to morning, right? Taking something that is in chaos and bringing it into order. However, there is the neutral, right? The idea of, okay, we've now brought these things to order. Now we'll just stop, right? And we won't do anything.
Mhm.
Well, inevitably, it will slip back into chaos, right? Just look at a building that we stop using, right? If we just stop using a building, or even if we continue to use the building and we don't do things like clean it regularly or take care of the boundaries of the building, the wildlife along the boundaries of the building, inevitably the chaos takes back over.
Derick,
right?
the point is that for 6 days out of the week, you are able to do all of those activities. For 1 day out of the week, you don't.
No. For 6 days out of the week, it is your job to advance. It's your job to build the new buildings, to expand the building, to do those kind of things. That is what I'm saying. For 6 days out of the week, it is your job to take something that is in chaos and bring it into order. 1 day a week, stop doing that. Stop doing that. And just, sure, do nothing as much as you can. But to the extent that you're doing nothing, make sure that nothing doesn't cause you to slip back into chaos. You must do at least enough to maintain the ground that you've gained. It's like if you're doing trench warfare, right? You advance for 6 days. On that 7th day, well, we'll just leave the trenches and just see where we are at the end of that day. No. Remain in that trench. Remain in that trench for that 7th day. And then the other 6 days, keep trying to advance your trenches. That's the war against chaos.
I disagree, but that's fine. I don't know if either of us have perfectly compelling cases for either one, but I think our points are well illustrated.
Well, I guess I'm saying that is the difference in category that I'm describing to you. Whereas I agree, maintenance and work are not the same thing. I define
the
work
difference in
as
category,
advancing the trench.
Okay, then difference in category that I'm describing would be that both of those are considered acts of work, whereas the emergency necessary things to intervene on the Sabbath is completely allowable and doable.
Which is why the translation that some people suggest is that the way it really should be translated. And in fact, maybe the way it may have been originally understood before our concept of rest has become corrupted.
Perhaps we should say that for next episode.
Yeah, but it is this
Leave
idea.
a little cliffhanger.
Yeah. It is this idea that God ceased creating and took up time to make, right? That's the point, is you're right. Both those things are work. They're two different categories of work. And some scholars are suggesting that idea of God stopping one particular kind of work to now do a different kind of work is actually a more accurate description of what that verse is saying and a more accurate translation of those words. And again, let's go to the tabernacle real quick, since you brought that up before, and I think that actually is a good thing to think about here. The idea of when you go to the tabernacle and you would perform the sacrifices and those kind of things, that wasn't necessarily a restful process per se, and it was a work of its own type. Was all of the things associated with the temple and all of the things associated with the Sabbath ongoings, right?
The argument is that God is resting in the tabernacle, not that the priests are resting. That's right, what it says, is that God is the one resting.
Right, but a lot of the religious ceremonies still took place on the Sabbath, right? For the people on the 7th day, their 7th day, their Sabbath, they would participate in religious ceremonies, which is a kind of work, a different kind of work than they've been doing all week. It's different than going to their job and doing whatever for whatever office, or they're farming or whatever they're doing, right? Whatever
the Israelites did.
Yeah, exactly, right? The old
they're
Israelite
walking
office, yeah. they're walking, they're animal husbandry, all of that, right? But that's a different activity, but it's not a cessation of activity. And I would argue it's not a cessation of work. It's a different kind of work when you participate in the religious ceremonies.
I
And
would
in a
have to.
way, this is something my wife and I have talked about too. Truthfully, honestly, going to church, especially when you have kids, it's not work. That's for sure.
Mhm.
It's definitely not work, getting up and getting everyone ready and getting out the door Sunday morning. So it is a very different kind of work, but it's not work. And so that what I'm suggesting is that, and again, these scholars are suggesting the translation here is a mistranslation, at least for our modern use of these terms, to say work and not work. It's actually one type of work to a different type of work. And that, I think, is where our split is. You, I think, are definitely still seeing the idea of going from work to not work.
Correct.
Okay. Well, then we will dig further into what we might be looking at as far as on this Sabbath day. This idea of this not the same type of work thing, and we'll take a look at that next episode. So until then, like, subscribe, follow, all those things. Email us at unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and let us know what you think. Do you think the Sabbath is going from work to not work, or work to a different kind of work? Let us know.
Yeah.